Hello, and welcome to Insead Knowledge. Today we have with us Luc van Wassenhove, Henry Ford Chaired Professor in Manufacturing in Insead, and Academic Director of Insead's Social Innovation Center. We're also joined by Rolando Tomasini, Research Group Leader at Insead's Social Innovation Center's Humanitarian Research Group. Welcome to both of you. In your new book, Humanitarian Logistics, you say that logistics is a key factor in the overall effectiveness of any humanitarian organization operation, and that private companies can contribute to improving the effectiveness of these operations. I was wondering if you could talk about why it is so important that logistics be efficient in a humanitarian operation, and is this a recent phenomenon, or is this something that's always been around?
I think it has changed a lot over the last 10 years. I think in 2000 people didn't really appreciate the importance of logistics and supply chain management to help people after a disaster. And the function in itself in humanitarian organizations was highly undervalued. And therefore, there was not sufficient attention, there was not sufficient training, there was not sufficient capability in the humanitarian organizations. This has changed because we had some very visible disasters like the tsunami, the Indian tsunami, we had the Asian tsunami, I'm sorry. We had the Pakistani earthquake, we had Katrina, where it was very difficult to get the stuff to the people. The media were all over it, and so it became clear that there were huge bottlenecks in logistics, and that logistics is a very central function. It's about getting the people there, it's about getting the goods there, and it's about getting the stuff there efficiently and fast. And so I think the importance of logistics in the organizations has grown substantially, as well as the means, the money to do something about it. At the same time, in the last 5 or 10 years, companies are searching for things to do in the context of corporate social responsibility. Now, if you're a logistics firm or a transportation firm, it makes a lot of sense to reach out to a humanitarian organization and say, hey, we know how to do this stuff, or at least we think we know how to do this stuff. Can we get into a partnership, and we're ready to help you with our knowledge, with our resources, and so on. So these two things came together. And so that in the last 5 years has increased the number of training programs and so on, and the importance of logistics in these organizations. But then again, there's only so much that you can transfer from business logistics to disaster logistics. Because when everything's destroyed, it's not the same thing. So you need new materials to support the training programs, and that's where this book basically comes from.
It would seem like there's big differences, though, between humanitarian organizations and private companies.
Oh, yeah.
That would pose a challenge to having them collaborate on.
Definitely. I mean, humanitarian organizations, by their own nature, actually are working in areas where there's high uncertainty, there's limited resources. They're basically able to put on a supply chain overnight without necessarily knowing where, who's affected, and what will be available on the spot. And this is basically a test to their agility and adaptability in their supply chain. If you look at this, the private sector, these are actually qualities of the supply chain that they would be very, very helpful to counteract some of the losses that have been when a new product is launched, when any low probability, high impact event comes to affect the continuity of any business. So this is part of the looking at the operational side of how humanitarian organizations are different on one side. On the other side, humanitarian organizations are working in a context that is completely different to the private sector that, as we know. First of all, they're not profit driven, and they're also working with a set of stakeholders that are not necessarily coordinated the same way, because there is no command and control. So they're able to assemble this and are driven by a set of guidelines such as humanity, neutrality, impartiality, that unless they're actually kept at its best, they would actually compromise their license to operate and put at risk their own personnel. So they're in their considerations for the operations, they're actually keeping in mind a different set of rules or principles, to be more precise, than the operations of a business partner would be.
You could say companies typically have a lot of money to invest in good systems. They have a supply chain that they can organize, that can work in sort of normal conditions, and they have clients that they need to target to get their products or services to. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's at least sort of a controlled environment. Humanitarian organizations, you don't have money to prepare usually. You get the money when something happened. So you have to then set up something from scratch. It's not so clear who the customer is. You just don't know how many people are affected and what they will need. You'll have to find out. You'll have to see that you can get the money to buy what you need and that people will be willing to give it to you. And I mean, who's going to be the target? Is it the beneficiary? Yes, of course, you need to help the people. But it's also, I need to make sure that I get the attention from the media, because if I get the attention from the media, my donors will be happy, and therefore I will get more money from my donors next time. So there's also competition. So it's a very different world, and we're not even talking about having to operate in a context where there's no bridges, there's no airports, that everything's been destroyed. And the people have to work in difficult conditions, because if it's after an earthquake, you're living in little tents and there's still severe aftershocks as, you know, humanitarian helper. So, you know, and of course these cultures between these two types of organizations, humanitarian and private, are extremely different, because they come at it from their own world. And they know their own world. But, you know, they have to learn how to work together to be able to make the combination work, right?
Is that a difficult challenge to overcome?
Getting them to... It's a huge challenge.
The conflicting cultures. And,
it's a huge challenge.
Do you have an example of where that's...
Well, most of the examples you see in, towards the end of the chapter, in chapter 7, you'll see how, you'll see a specifically example of TNT and the World Food Program through Moving the World, on the different steps of how they designed their partnership and how they implement it. But looking at it globally in terms of the differences between the two and the challenges that come out, you will see that there is a strong need to actually recognize with a sense of being humble that you will learn from each other. And that's not that for many there is such a willingness to collaborate and to get involved at the beginning that there isn't enough preparation ahead of time. The difference in cultures comes a lot because there's a huge misunderstanding. Historically, you see that the private sector and the humanitarian sector have worked together, but only in contractual agreements or completely donors. Now they're actually coming together to the table to look at what can be done beyond a well-written contract, what can be done beyond just performing on time what was agreed on legal terms, to actually engage new stakeholders. And these are two people who actually never really, one of them looks at the other and says, you're only here to make the money, and the other one's looking at the other saying, you're just here to save life. I mean, where do we meet eye to eye?
Well, yeah, what is in it for a private company, for example? I mean, you've mentioned CSR, corporate social responsibility, good public relations that way, but are there other advantages?
There's engagement of the personnel, pride in the company, because, you know, if you're operating, if you're a big transportation company, or you know, if you're a big fast-moving consumer goods company for that matter, and you operate in a particular country that is prone to disasters, and a disaster happens, your personnel and their families will say, what is my company doing? And so, you know, it is, if you're part of the social tissue, you will be expected as a company to do something. Now, what you could do is partner with a humanitarian organization to be able to provide help when something happens in the countries where you operate. But then again, the culture is still very difficult, very different, because, you know, very often, this is changing now, but we still see it. The company will come in and say, we know everything about logistics, and you guys are just very inefficient. Let me tell you how we're going to do things. And of course, they don't know how to operate after a disaster, right?
They're not used to operating in disasters. They have
that's right.
a calm environment normally that they work in.
That's right. And then the humanitarians will say, well, wait a minute. And they will say, okay, you can help us now, but you know, when you have a financial crisis and then we have a disaster next year, will you still help us? Because now we trust you that you will help us. But if you then say after the financial crisis, oh, I'm sorry, this is not a good time for us, hey. So, you know, there is this whole thing about how do you build the trust? How do you learn how to work together? How do you align the cultures with each other? How do you learn about each other's world? How do you learn about what you can offer, what you cannot offer? And it takes time. I mean, just the culture between, you mentioned TNT and the World Food Program, TNT, they decide something, and 24 hours later it's implemented. So they go and say, let's go with this partnership, and WFP says, well, you know, we don't really have the resources this year. We didn't put it in our budget. We'll put it in our budget for next year. Well, next year is not in 24 hours, right? So you got all these cultural clashes, you know. Yes, you have to go through that to learn how to work together.
And through that process is actually of getting to know where you fit, where you can have the highest impact and value for both of us. I mean, there is this notion, as we explored earlier, that there is the humanitarian agencies function in a humanitarian space that is regulated by the principles that they protect. Companies cannot necessarily come and be a part of that space in the front office. When you're working in areas where there's conflict, you actually need to be represented by your own brand, be it Red Cross, be UN. You cannot have a company be on the field. And it takes time for these companies to understand that they can add more value on the back office functions and sometimes in the support functions. There are companies that have had high impact getting involved by donating, for example, some of their office space in areas that have been affected. By donating some of their know-how in calling centers, or by seconding some of their technical staff in order to redesign a warehouse or a process or a system within the organization that allows the NGO or the UN agencies to be more responsive at the moment when they're needed, as opposed to trying to coordinate the volunteers and the employees that are trying to get to the ground as well.
Is that a problem where the private company wants to be on the front line in order to get visibility for their mark, their logo?
And fair enough, but actually the process, by understanding the process of the logistics process that we outline in the book, it's actually easier to understand that some of the areas in which you can add more value are defined from the beginning of the supply chain process till the end, that it's not just the last mile distribution, where it's actually more difficult to operate, that you could have that recognition and that value.
But yeah, the answer is yes. The more they get the visibility, the better for the private companies. So they will always strive for that visibility, as long as they understand that, you know, this is work that needs to be done by the people who really know how to do it, which is the humanitarians. That's fine. You know, they can still give their truck, and the truck can be on CNN. You know, but that's different than interfering in the work, because if you're not knowledgeable on how to do that work, you can do more harm than good. So you could, in the background, do a lot of good, like you're organizing the warehouses, setting up the information systems, helping them with whatever, so that humanitarians can become more effective and more efficient. And then you could still have some trucks that are visible on the TV screens. That's fine. But you got to be careful with these things, because there is typical last mile humanitarian work should be done by humanitarians.
They're experts.
And there are issues also of how you set up the collaboration. For example, there was ways in which you should communicate with your humanitarian partners, even if you participate at different levels. It's not a common, but an unfortunate mistake that has been seen is that sometimes organizations think that their drop in the ocean of contribution, as significant as it may be by the goodwill of those involved, has saved the world, and it actually has only helped to the humanitarian organizations to do a better job where they can. It doesn't put it's good to understand the roles and responsibilities of each one and how they come to play. At the same time, it has to do with communication. It has to do with the way the exchanges are done, and it has to do also with we've learned a lot through the progression of these relationships, because at the beginning there was a misunderstanding that if I'm your partner, the partnerships could have been exclusive, and that's something actually we have found through time that is very inefficient, because humanitarian organizations, by partnering with these companies, should retain, and have retained actually through the practice, the possibility to engage with all of their partners in the specific sectors. So it's supposed to help coordination of the partners, not to restrain them.
I would imagine that humanitarian organizations have developed a lot of expertise in supply chain management under hostile conditions, or working under hostile conditions in general. Can that be applied to private companies?
Right.
They don't generally work in hostile conditions, but working under demanding conditions of various kinds.
They're very unusual circumstances, right? You don't know the terrain, you don't know what's been destroyed, you don't know what you're going to need. So these humanitarians have become extremely flexible, sensitive, reactive to, you know, to changing conditions, because the information changes every day, the needs change every day, so you have to be extremely flexible and sometimes not necessarily tremendously efficient to help the people. And so to be able to react so agile to these conditions is something that they're very good at. And you know, companies to some extent need more and more because they're getting into areas where they're not familiar with, new markets, they're getting into shorter product life cycles and, you know, more uncertain conditions. They're getting into more, unstable markets where they have to react much faster and quickly adapt to changing situations and organize for it. And they're not necessarily good at that. And so that, the other thing that they can learn from humanitarians is, you know, you can say what you want about, and there is a lot of criticism sometimes on humanitarians that they're not necessarily efficient, but these people will work, you know, their back off in very, very difficult situations. Their motivation is just incredible sometimes. Private companies would pay fortunes to get motivated workforce like that. And they will need it after the financial crisis, by the way, because they destroyed a lot of loyalty.
But also to go back into your question, the way that humanitarian organizations operate is because they're recognized by society. They're recognized by the different parts of society, be the belligerent or not parts of them. Companies don't necessarily have the luxury to be in the dialogue or even know how to handle the dialogue with some of these companies. So it is an important part that we can learn from them, because they can actually recognize signals, and through the way that they have embedded themselves into these areas, about what's it like to operate in such circumstances, when is it the right time, and how to go about operating in those times. And we have examples of companies that actually have used those relationships with the humanitarian sector nowadays to become embedded in society and actually become more aware of some of the issues that otherwise they would have not recognized as either important stakeholders or of an impact to their business.
Yeah, I think Walmart is a good example of its reaction to Katrina and all the credibility it got because of that. And I think they themselves realized how powerful this was, and that changed Walmart in terms of what do we need to do for the communities that we live in and work in as a company. And so, you know, so you see that even companies very often don't realize that society expects them to do something in times of crisis.
So you're seeing this collaboration occurring now more regularly, I suppose?
Well, especially as we focus more on emerging markets, you cannot function in some of these markets without necessarily understanding the agenda of the different stakeholders. And that's not a traditional business model that we have, especially for companies that are looking for new opportunities in areas where that are completely untapped.
And people want to work more and more for companies that they can be proud of. And you can see more and more in hiring. I mean, start this whole story again about the war for talent and what have you. I mean, again, after the crisis, probably this war will start again. But if you start a war for talent, the people today, and we know that from TNT, a number of people going for a job interview mentioning the fact that TNT has this partnership with the World Food Program, and that's a very important part of them for why they would want to work for TNT. So access to talent, you know, pride of the employees. People want their company to stand for more than making an awful lot of money.
It's at the organizational level and also at the personal level. They want leaders that represent society as well. I mean, a social leader, and that's part of the effort that we try through our case studies as they're used in the MBA and executive education courses, is to show that there's actually much more to manage beyond the bottom line. And that's what these people that are going to the companies are looking for a CEO that stands behind not only the business part, but also the causes that the company can stand for and represents, that is conscious of the social impact, and that it gives them also an opportunity through doing their work to have that impact on society. And that at times includes quotes that we have heard from many CEOs saying, when you're sitting in my seat, you're hearing right and left in the geographies where we are, or in the businesses that we operate, if there's noise, because you know that noise, whether it be wind or it be bullets, can hit us, and it'll hit the house of one of our employees as well as our customers. So we will get hit. It's no longer, there isn't that separation between the individual and the company at that point.
Luc van Wassenhove and Rolando Tomasini, thank you for joining us today on Insead Knowledge.